If I could get your attention up here, we're going to get started. Hi, I'm Carl Chemnitz. I'm Senior Vice Provost. It's my pleasure to be introducing Craig Simpson. He's going to be telling us about the Kent State shootings at 50, Rage, Reflection, and Remembrance. And this is part of the University Scholars Series, which we've been doing for quite a few years, and it's sponsored by the Provost's Office, the library, and others who have brought this together. And I know that Craig's talk is really good. I'm really interested in hearing about this. I've been hearing about it through all sorts of different venues, but I haven't heard really the oral history of Kent State, which I think is fascinating. I saw that Craig is an alumnus of Kent State, although I don't think, unless he has a serum of youth, that he was contemporaneous there.
I was born in 1970.
So he missed that by a few years. And he's been here for a couple of years as the director of Special Collections and Archives here in the MLK Library. So please welcome Craig, and he'll leave some time for questions at the end.
Thank you, Carl, very much. Thank you all for coming, particularly on a very eventful day like today. I'm probably losing power as we speak. Very exciting. And it's also Yom Kippur as well today. So thank you for coming. I think, why don't we start with titles? Over the summer, I was asked to come up with a title for this presentation, and after a lot of hemming and hawing, I settled on the one here because alliteration is usually a good thing. But then when the semester started, I contacted Leslie, and she got the message that I'm sure she loves to hear, which is, I don't like that title, can we change it? And it was too late, so that's on me. But you know what? I think it's okay because it's illustrative of a key point about this event, which I've been studying now or kind of involved with one way or another for about the last 15 years or so. And that is that when it comes to Kent State, titles, definitions, labels, how we have interpreted this event over the last soon to be 50 years in May of 2020 has been a subject of a lot of discussion and a lot of contention. And it's fitting in a way when a lot of people have gotten it wrong. And it's only been fairly recently, I think, as we'll see throughout this talk today, that I think more in the last decade or so, I think attempts to try to understand what happened have been better. And the way we have tried to remember it, I think, has improved as well. You can say that a lot of the mistakes happened from the very beginning. These are 3 headlines from newspapers in Northeast Ohio. And one thing they have in common is they are all wrong. The Kent Record Courier on May 4, 1970 reported that 2 guardsmen and 1 student died in the university's Muss House hooligans. It also, then the Cleveland Plain Dealer on May 5th was a little better, a little more accurate, with 4 dead and 10 hurt. And the Akron Beacon Journal in the bottom right mentioned 4 killed and 12 shot. The Akron Beacon Journal, though, eventually won a Pulitzer for their coverage of the shootings, because overall they had the most accurate reporting. And one reason because of that is because Kent State University had an excellent school for journalism, and many students in that school were interning at the Akron Beacon Journal. So many of them actually witnessed the shootings, which were right outside of Taylor Hall, where the journalism school was. In case you're wondering what was happening in San Jose at that time, also on May 4, indeed there were protests going on here too, and some parallels to what was happening at Kent and elsewhere. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well too. One thing that we have that has been, I think, more impressionable have been the images from the shootings. There were many students who took photographs. In fact, they were encouraged, not knowing what was going to happen, they were encouraged to go to the rally and to photograph the event from some of their professors. It was John Philo, who was a student at Kent State, who took what became this iconic photograph that won a Pulitzer Prize. It's Marianne Vecchio, who was not a student. She was a runaway from Florida at about 14 or 15. And she's over the body of Jeffrey Miller, who's one of the 4 students who were killed. There were, John Philo, ironically, he tried to submit this photograph and others to the Akron Beacon Journal, and they told him no because they already had enough. And he was afraid that his photos would get confiscated, which did happen to more than a few student photographers. And so he went across the border to a small town in Pennsylvania, I forget the name, but they're the ones who eventually first published this photograph, which eventually appeared in Life magazine. The literature of Kent, the written word, has been honestly pretty spotty, pretty flawed from the beginning. The first and probably still best known book is Kent State, What Happened and Why by James Michener, which came out, I think it was early 1971 that this book came out. It's because Michener was a gifted novelist, it has a lot of captivating and interesting anecdotes, which unfortunately many of them are false, and many of them also I think it did a lot of harm in some of the early impressions of the shootings. I think a lot of people still kind of draw from a lot of some of the myths that came out of that book. Also, speaking of titles, the next book I have here, 13 Seconds, is in reference to the amount of time that the National Guard opened fire, and by Joe Esterhaus and Michael D. Roberts. Four Dead in Ohio by Bill Gordon is the title of a book that he self-published, and in fact he has self-published this book. It's the same book, but there are 3 different titles to it. Four Dead in Ohio is the best known one. So these are more popular books. A more academic book, which is very good, by Tom Hensley, is The Kent State Incident: Impact of Judicial Process on Public Attitudes. And a couple more recent books. There is 67 Shots by Howard Means, which came out about 2 weeks before our book did in 2016, and it also drew pretty heavily from the oral history interviews. And that title, of course, is referring to the number of shots that were fired in those 13 seconds. I think the best book for anyone who might be interested is by Tom Grace, which is Kent State, Death and Dissent in the Long 60s. Tom was one of the wounded students, and he also became a really excellent historian and scholar. And so his book combines both of these sides of him. So it has both kind of the personal, and it has the academic side as well too. The Long 60s, incidentally, in the subtitle is often what historians refer to kind of attitudes or movements, or maybe just kind of the protest movement in general, which started around 1965 and then continued. Some say it ended on May 4, 1970. The great thing about Tom's book is it really, I think, demythologizes some of the assumptions about Kent State. He writes in his introduction that it's a subject that once familiar, yet often poorly understood. And the 2 things he does, I think, are really valuable, is he traces the origins of the protest movement in Northeast Ohio to really around 1961 was the first protest. One of the myths that Michener's book perpetuates is that the shootings kind of came out of the blue, or that the protest that day came out of nowhere. The historical record shows that that was patently false, and Tom really does a great job of charting really all of the social activism at Kent State throughout that decade, of which he became a part of in 1968 or 69. And he also talks about, after the fact as well, that May 4, 1970 did not end the protest movement, but that in fact it actually lit a fire under a wave of campus protest that occurred afterward. Also, in terms of definitions and terms, I thought I would point this out because I think it's interesting. The Library of Congress originally, if you look at the very bottom, from the very beginning of publications of this event, they were always referred to under the subject heading Kent State University Riot, 1970, May 4. And that was always pretty irksome to a great deal of people who were there. And I was working at Kent State Special Collections. I started in 2004. And right around 2005, my colleague, who's the cataloger there, she petitioned the Library of Congress to get them to change the subject heading, which I did not know you could do. And they did it, and I think around 2006. So now it's called Kent State Shootings, Kent, Ohio, and it has a couple of variants that you can see down there. I like this story because I think it was right around that time that some of the kind of the narrative of the shootings began to change, from sort of identifying it as a riot and thereby implying that the students or the protesters were to blame, to identifying it as the responsibility of the people who fired the guns. So our book came out in 2016 as well. And the title for this book was my idea, and nobody liked it. Everybody said, well, there'll be a working title, we'll come if we come up with something better. But we ended up kind of settling on it. I came up with Above the Shots because I was the head of the oral history project there for most of my time there, 2004, 2005 to 2010. And I just kind of had this idea. I so much loved this project and really loved interviewing all of these narrators that I think what I love most about it is that I saw their voices sort of rising above the din, kind of rising above all this noise and dispute about Kent State, and really started to clarify things in a way that I've never known before that. I was superficially knowledgeable about what happened. I think I learned about it in high school, probably like many people. But I never really got to know a lot about it and how complicated and fascinating it was until I started working on this project. So the book started to take shape out of that. And my co-author, Greg Wilson, who is a history professor at the University of Akron, he and I settled on an idea that this book would be a little bit different from some of the other titles that I have shown you. Most of the books on Kent State focus almost exclusively on May 4, maybe the 3 or 4 days leading up to it, so it's a pretty tight time frame. And most of them focus kind of exclusively on just one question, and it's an important question, which is why did the guard open fire? And there are interpretations of that ranging from fairly basic to more conspiratorial. But our objective was not necessarily to dismiss that question, but we wanted to frame it within a much wider perspective. So we wanted to chart the narrative and some of the competing narratives from the decade prior to May 4, 1970 through the long 60s that Tom mentioned, through the 5 decades leading up to pretty close to the present day. And we wanted to focus not just on what happened, but we were also very interested in how and why people remember what they did. Greg's specialty is memory studies. And in his introduction in our book, he references Catherine Hodgkin and Susanna Radstone, Contested Past. And he quotes them as saying the focus of contestation is very often not conflicting accounts about what happened in the past, so much as a question of who or what is entitled to speak for that past in the present. And Greg adds, I italicize it at the bottom, he adds that that's very much true, but when it comes to this particular topic, it's very much about what happened as much as the meaning. And we see that in so many of these narratives, whether they are 5 minutes long or whether they're an hour or 2 hours. What I brought to the table in this collaboration was my work as both an oral historian and an archivist. And there's probably no better article that combines these two topics than the one by Linda Shopes, Insights and Oversights. And Shopes talks about how we typically identify oral history's intellectual trajectory as moving, kind of starting from an understanding of the interview as an archival document to then its movement, its trajectory as a narrative construction. And but Shopes argues something a little bit different, that the course of development isn't really quite that tidy, and that the very first oral historians, even though they didn't really call themselves oral historians, they weren't ignorant of oral history's textual complexity, and a great deal of more recent work is fundamentally archival and additive. And that really struck me pretty profoundly too, because one thing we did that's a lot different than other oral history projects is we did our own transcription, just literally us typing it. We didn't use any of the transcript automated things that you can use. And when you do that, you really start to learn the complexity of these narratives. And I could give an entirely different talk on the excitement of transcribing, but that'll be another time. Anyone that's interested. But all those things kind of came into play when we were talking about how to write this book. Because I'll be honest, at first my idea, because there have been books like this, was simply to take, I kind of had an idea of a big ensemble cast. So there's over 100 interviews total in the collection, maybe use about 50 of them, and sort of follow this ensemble as they talked about what happened. But then when Greg came into the picture, we decided to sort of maybe make things a little bit more challenging, but hopefully for ourselves, but hopefully beneficial for the readers, which would be to insert our voices and our own interpretations in as well. So it was a little bit complicated to weave through, but I think on the whole it came out okay. But really, it's the interviews are the foundation, and I'll give you a link to this a little bit later. But you can access all these interviews, and you can look at a lot that's in this collection online through Kent State Special Collections. Another thing on titles. If is anyone here from Northeast Ohio? No? Well, in Northeast Ohio, this is called the May 4, oftentimes. So when you say the May 4, people usually know what you're talking about. And so that's why this is called the Kent State Shootings May 4 collection. And the oral histories are really just kind of one relatively small component of it. There's a lot of documentation. There is a great deal of it has been digitized, and I'm sure it'll just be a collection that kind of keeps going. It's really an umbrella title for a bunch of different sub-collections. The Oral History Project just real quick, started long before I ever got to Kent State. It began in 1990 by a woman named Sandra Perlman-Hala, who did not work at the university. She was the co-director of the Historical Society in Kent. And she eventually donated these interviews. And she collected about 70 interviews. And they mostly were commemoration-based. They have an annual commemoration on the campus every year. And most of the interviews she did were from the 1990, 1995, and 2000 commemorations. Those are usually the big ones that end in 5 or 0. These interviews, they're great. They tend to be more monologues than Q&As, more than maybe what I think many oral historians would term a typical oral history interview. They tend to focus on a pretty narrow time frame. And Sandy was very much, she acknowledged that herself in saying that the goal was the accumulation of data for this. And I think she succeeded very well. One quick example of an interview from her time period was Carol Meerman, who is on the top left that you see there. Carol, as you can see, was an eyewitness to the shootings. She also became known as one of the Kent 25, which were 24 students and 1 faculty member who were indicted by Portage County grand jury as being to blame for the shootings. It was later, all the charges were eventually later dropped. But Carol's interview doesn't talk about that at all. It starts mainly with where a lot of this event starts, which is when Nixon announces his invasion of Cambodia the night of April 30th, 1970, which was considered to be a deep betrayal because it was believed Nixon ran in 1968 under the idea that he would do Vietnam de-escalation following LBJ. Then on Carol and other narrators from the Spades one also talk about often that Friday night, May 1st, where there were riots in downtown Kent as largely a response to this. They also made the mistake of imposing a curfew around at the bars that night around 6 o'clock, which some narrators said had the effect of sending everyone out into the street, drunk and angry, and broke a lot of windows and scared a lot of people and did a lot of physical damage to the area. Then on May 2nd, Carol and other narrators talk about the burning of the ROTC building. The ROTC building on campus was a abandoned barracks and not been used since the 1950s. It was dilapidated. It was old. There was no one in there. And one thing you learn from a lot of these interviews, including some that I did, is everybody in town knew about this burning, that it was going to happen. One person, more than one person I interviewed, said, "Hey, people were saying, hey, let's pack a lunch or pack a dinner and come and watch the burning." So everybody knew about it. And but this ended up prompting the mayor of Kent to call and ask the governor to summon the National Guard. So the Guard actually started appearing that night, Saturday night, and continued into Sunday morning. The National Guard that had been called had just been pulled off a very difficult Teamster strike. They were responsible for guarding truckers who had broken a strike. And so the guardsmen had actually been shot at in some cases and harassed and so forth. So they thought they were going to get some relief. So when they were called to Kent, they already had a lot of lack of sleep, and they were very much on edge through their 2.5 days that they were there. And Governor Rhodes, just to say something briefly about him, because many narrators blame him as one of the key parties responsible for the shootings. Governor Rhodes was running for the Senate at that time in Ohio, and he was losing in the Republican primary. So he came to Kent after the ROTC building burned down and used this as an attempt to build up his campaign prior to the ballot on that Tuesday. Rhodes took a page from Governor Reagan that time of California, and he blamed if you listen to the audio on the site, you can hear him banging his fist on the table, and he blames the brown shirts and all the outside agitators and a whole bunch of other stereotypical villains from Hollywood casting. So so that night there were also, kind of going back, that night there were protests in the streets as well. And one thing narrators like Carol Merriman also talk about is they were trying to study for midterm exams, and there would be tear gas containers. Sometimes they could smell the tear gas wafting through their dorm windows. Helicopters buzzing and buzzing a light on them. So everything was very much on edge as they entered Monday, May 4, which was the first day of midterm exams. And there was a lot of confusion about whether or not there was a rally and whether or not it was banned. The president of the university was away. I think he came back late Sunday night. But anyway, at 12:24 p.m., the guard opened fire, and they killed 4 students, Allison Krauss, Bill Schroeder, Jeffrey Miller, and Sam Scheuer, and they wounded 9 students. On the cover of Life is John Cleary, who I interviewed, I think, in 2009 or 2010. And so that was the accurate number. Phase 2 was when I started, and we ended up interviewing, we being me and a few of my students who were interested, clicked about 40 interviews, and we wanted to have a greater variety of narrators and not just make it commemoration based, because if you're going to interview narrators solely on the commemorations, you're going to get mainly alumni. So we wanted to kind of broaden it somewhat. We also wanted to broaden the time frame. So in addition to getting narrators who were not just former students and faculty, but also we managed to interview a couple of National Guardsmen. We interviewed a couple of members of Black United students who were told to stay away from the rally that day. We also interviewed a couple of presidents of the university who came later, and I'll show you that in just a moment. And just kind of turning it from an analog project to a digital project, applying focused questions for interview structures, and really just making the goals just enhancing accessibility and understanding, and really opening up avenues for research. So some of the topics that narrators talked about were the development of the campus in the 1960s. I think in 1959, Kent State had 6,000 students, and by 1969, they had over 20,000 students. So that's a huge, huge growth in a small town. And there were many, many protests in the late 60s, as I mentioned, Tom Grace documented. One of them was the Black United Students walkout in November of 1968. That was when they protested the Oakland Police Department recruiting on the Kent State campus. The Oakland PD, of course, was notorious for targeting the Black Panthers in Oakland and people of color in general. So the Kent State administration was, fairly hostile to student protest, student activism in general, which was not untypical of most universities at that time. Then we wanted to look afterward as well. So we talked to narrators who were there for what was called Tent City in 1977, which was a protest of the building of a gym annex on part of the site. It was not the site of the actual shootings, but it was close enough that geographically it's interesting in how I think it really altered. It was interesting with one narrator I'll show you where the landscape was physically altered. A lot of legal cases throughout the 70s, Krauss versus Rhodes, 1978, 1979. The trial, by all accounts, was something of a farce. The guard kind of issued a non-apology apology, and there was a very, very low sum of money that was given to the families of the dead students, as well as the wounded students too. Memorialization is a theme we also cover in our book. There was a lot of debate of whether to memorialize the shootings at all. There was even question whether the university would survive. They talked about turning it into a mental institution in the early 1970s. They even wanted to change the name from Kent State to Kent. And then there was finally a memorial design competition that turned into yet another debacle in the late 80s, where the original winner of the design competition, he ended up being Canadian, which I guess you had to be a citizen of the United States to win. So they got the one that came in second. And as you can see, it's a pretty, a lot of narrators talk about how it's a pretty uninspiring design. So there was a lot of that. But I think things have, as I mentioned, I think the memorialization has improved significantly. But one key event was in 2010. There was an Ohio historical marker to officially acknowledge the site. I had a hand in, I helped the faculty who were behind this in scanning a lot of the images for the proposal. And now it's actually been declared a national landmark as well. And if anyone ever goes to Kent State, I highly recommend, please go to the May 4 Visitor Center, which officially opened in 2015. It is a tremendously informative and very moving, permanent exhibition that you walk through. And it's, I think it really does more than anything else that's been done to educate students and anyone interested in this event in terms of what happened. Our book also gets into a lot of rumors, conspiracies, or alternate theories, which is kind of an interesting subtopic in oral history. Eldon Fender, who's in the background there, was a gentleman I interviewed, and he claimed that Jeffrey Miller, if you look at this here, that Jeffrey Miller was much closer than he actually was, and he claimed he saw him throwing rocks at the guard and so on and so forth. And I think Mr. Fender was sincere, but he's just factually wrong. There was at least 200 yards separating these two things. He was also wrong about what he said he was wearing at the time too. And in Howard Means's book, one thing that's a little disappointing is the author does not challenge stories like this in any way. He just repeats them at face value. So in our book, you know, we tried to apply, not to play gotcha with the narrators, but when they did say something that was just factually wrong, it was important to correct those things. But I think it's interesting too in that if you see where Eldon Fender was standing, that's right where the gym annex was built. And I do feel like there's something to the idea of a site's landscape being altered and how it can perhaps even alter your memory or your interpretation. I also interviewed a woman named Catherine Delattre. You can't see her very well. This is when the guard opened fire in the parking lot. Her boyfriend, became her husband, is pushing her down in the background there. And there's a better photograph of her and her boyfriend behind. Glenn Frank, who was a geology professor and many credit with preventing more bloodshed. He basically begged the students who were very angry after the shootings to stand down and eventually leave, which they did. And let's see. So almost as important as titles or subtitles, we tried to make our book, you know, we called it an oral history, not the oral history. And that's because we didn't want to do sort of a write a case closed kind of book. that you sometimes see. We wanted to open up our avenues for further research, and I think there's all kinds of possibilities with that resonate today. Political activism, student protest, gun control, campus violence, campus response, and really just the whole narratives and counter-narratives about the 60s, which we see playing out White House, classrooms, and TV news and everything. So I think some other potential more specific topics that are worth noting is the events at Jackson State College on May 15th, 1970. There were 2 students killed on that day, Philip Gibbs, who was a junior, and James Earl Green, who was a high school senior, and 12 were wounded as well. But Jackson State is sort of the forgotten topic. There is no Library of Congress subject heading on Jackson State shootings. And it's really a subject that I think there's a lot of potential for research and study and publication. The annual commemoration at Kent makes a point of combining the Jackson State shootings with the Kent State shootings together. But I think there's a lot of new terrain that people can talk about. In SJSC, one of my interests since I've been here, and I realized, wow, I have access to these boxes here. It was a good fit for my interests with political activism and some of these events. So I started kind of looking in and seeing parallel what was happening at San Jose State at the same time as Kent State, and how maybe Kent State was looked at from the point of view here in the Bay Area. But this is from President Hobart Burns's collection with the headline in July 4th, 1969, where deans say campus unrest is decreasing, was their prediction. And then in the Merc on April 18th, 1970, they talk about how they're praising San Jose State and saying, unlike Stanford and Berkeley, in San Jose, in the 3rd paragraph, a small languid demonstration trickled off into a parade to St. James Park, where speakers castigated the war in Vietnam briefly and then went on to other things. And so they're complimenting San Jose, and President Burns was irate by this. He wrote the editorial board and said, why don't you just invite people to protest here? And sure enough, 2.5 weeks later, this is what's happening on campus. And it would kind of continue on. So in addition to headlines like this, I've also been kind of just looking at looking right now kind of for references to Kent State. So there was an editorial on May 5th in the Spartan Daily is where this is from, where they just kind of report the facts, mostly accurately. This is a letter from Hobart Burns to a Mr. Ross Cade, who was angered that San Jose State and President Burns granted approval to lower the flag to half-mast to honor the students who were killed at Kent State. So Burns defends this, although at the very end he does blame the Kent State shootings on irrational, irresponsible, radical revolutionaries. So that was a fairly typical thing. And then this article, Kent State, How and Why, talks about the shootings, and tolerant is spelled incorrectly, but this is a very good article. It's well written from somebody who lived close to Kent, I think from Ravenna. And he actually knew, he speaks from personal experience that there was in fact a lot of protest prior to 1970, that it should not have been a surprise necessarily that it happened there. Political cartoon in the Spartan Daily as well, although Nixon would be reelected in 1972. And eventually our small languid campus became the strike capital, as set for strike headquarters. This was on May 11th, 1970. There's no date there, but it was on May 11th. So, yeah, and then this editorial, despite the unfortunate title, it's really thoughtful, I think, because it does combine, whoever wrote it combines and connects Kent State with Jackson State. And it says, let's see, it says at the very end, it talks mainly about Jackson State. It says, talking about ending racism in America depends less on legislation, on that change in attitude on the part of white America. Changing attitudes depend on moral leadership. The students of America now have a chance to provide that moral leadership. So I thought these things were really interesting, and I look forward to continuing. So, thank you. This topic is so complicated. The bad thing is you have to, there are certain things you just don't have time to talk about. So, but this is, if I did not address something you would like to ask a question about, or if you'd like me to clarify something. Yes, sir.
Just a quick question, maybe I missed something. Why did the National Guard shoot the real bullets rather than tear gas or other things?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So they did fire tear gas initially, and the wind was carrying the tear gas so far off the mark that students were picking up the tear gas canisters and throwing them back. It was like volleying back and forth. So yeah, why did they use real bullets? That's a very good question, and that's something I don't have an answer to, other than I think it ties into the aggressive policies that they were taking at the time to put down, starting to take to put down student protests. Yeah. There's a microphone. Yes. Oh, what? Sorry. Wait for the. Oh. No. The mic's coming. Sorry. I want to make sure people can hear.
So you alluded to the difference between a monologue and an oral history, and you talked at the very beginning about people's memories and how they tend to, the story changes in their mind. So how do you, as a researcher and an oral historian, work in that framework and try to adjust for inaccuracies and things like that?
In the case of our book, that's one thing that we tried to do, was once we decided that it wasn't just going to be 50 narrators talking, but that we were going to insert ourselves in the narrative, so to speak. Then it became an idea of sort of trying to balance what the narrators were saying and just cross-checking it, I guess, with the historical record. And some things are just factually there, like the example that I gave of Eldon Fender. There's no ambiguity with that. He's just playing wrong on that. And we were initially, I think more for me than Greg. I think because when you interview these narrators, you get attached to them, and you don't want to. I was initially, I think, a little reluctant to be critical at first, and Tom, who was one of our readers, he gave us some good advice and got on us and told us to be more critical, and not just with him, but with everyone. So I think, oral history, it's one piece of the puzzle. It has things that regular historical records and documentation don't. Also, documents and records can lie as well, or they can be wrong. But I think being able to, but then the reverse can be very true as well. So it's again, in case of our book, it was a difficult balance to achieve. Whenever I go back and read it, I'm like, there's always something else that I wish I had caught or read it a little bit more clearly. But that's kind of how we proceeded with that. Yeah. Yes.
Well, you showed us on the photographs some of the people that you interviewed, and they were all students, and from presumably the side of the victims. and they might be hard to track down, but I imagine that it's easy to track down the people who were in the National Guard because there must be records of the service and who was there on that day. Granted, they might be a bit older than the students, so many might not be around, but not much, unlike politicians or the chief of police, etc. Did you also interview some of them?
Yes, so there are in the total, which last I checked is about 110, 120 interviews. There are 3 with National Guardsmen, and one of them is anonymous. There was an anonymous one, I think in 1990 or 95, and then I interviewed 2 more after that. The Guard are very easy to track down. The problem is they do not talk. And in fact, the 3 that have been interviewed, none of them were actually any of them who were part of that group that opened fire. The closest would be, there was one Guardsman I interviewed who tried to plant a gun on Jeffrey Miller on his body, and he was called out for it in court. But they do not talk. We attempted to do so, but they just don't. And that's, they have their reasons for doing that. It's unfortunate from a historical perspective. And even there's another book called I Was There, which is written by a Guardsman. He was on campus, but he wasn't there. He did not actually witness the shooting. So yeah, it's one of those gaps that we just have to deal with. Yes, sir.
I'd like to thank you for the inclusion of the Jackson State, because that's a very important episode that usually does get bypassed in the flow. Is there any work being done on an oral history of San Jose State during the months up to the famous Olympic display by Tommy Smith and John Carlos?
It's a great idea, for one. Harry Edwards has been involved in a lot of that. But that's an excellent idea for one. One thing I want to do is, which my staff has heard countless times, but one thing I want to do is to put all the oral histories that we have in our collection, or as many as we can, online. We have excellent oral histories, not relating to that topic specifically, but there's the Chicano oral history, there's the Indian diaspora. Our colleague Mantra is working on a great oral history project kind of tying into that, and I'm definitely open, based on my research here, to definitely other possibilities of activism during that period. Time for more questions. Yeah.
So you had mentioned that in the second phase of the collection that you had more focused questions for your interviews. So I was wondering about the nature of those and how you came up with those and how that may have affected or impacted the thematic development.
In fact, I can give you an example. Sorry, we ran a little short on time. I was hoping to show you. This is Catherine Delatra, whose photos I showed you. This is a transcript of an interview I did with her in 2008. And what I tried to do, focusing my questions, was I always come up with about 8 to 10 questions. And a couple of them are just kind of straightforward biographical questions in the beginning. That accomplishes 2 things. Number one, it's important for the metadata of the oral histories, and it also kind of relaxes the narrators, because many of these interviews are pretty emotional, and so just kind of getting them started talking about themselves, rather than in kind of the early era, just sort of plunging in, what were you doing on May 4? I wanted to sort of give them a chance to think about those things. And then, so like with Catherine here, I always, would just ask them where they were born and when they went to Kent State, what made them decide to go to Kent State. One thing about the late 60s, one reason Kent State really exploded with student population is because it stopped being kind of a local campus, a regional campus, and they had many more students coming in from the East Coast in particular. So, but Catherine, I believe, was a native of Northeast Ohio. And then I kind of just asked them to talk about their impressions of the university, and then I told them they could kind of start wherever they would like with me for. And Catherine started with the events on Thursday as well. And then, you know what? We do have time. I'm just going to play a little part of this where she talks about some things at the end. I always ask a question at the end where I would say, "Is there anything else you'd like to share?" And this is what she said.
Are there any other thoughts you'd like to share?
Let's see if I can turn that up.
I think there was a part of me that waited for years was always looking for there to be somebody take the blame for this. And that was a hard thing to accept all those years as a student and having been there, that no one was really punished for what happened. That those poor families, it took years and years and years for the families of the students who were killed to get anything. And I can't even imagine what it must have been like for those parents all those years. And I think finally there was money paid to the families, right? But you know, I mean, at the time, you didn't know what exactly had happened, and you wanted to know. I remember that the FBI came. I was picked out from photographs, like many people were, and I came home from school one day, or not from school, but from school was closed, but we were doing the research, and I came home and there was a sign, an official sign from the FBI, and it said, I forget his name, and I wish I still had that piece of paper, but somehow I got lost.
It was on your door.
It was on my door. Agent so-and-so would like to speak to you. Right. You must report at this time in this building on campus for this interview. And it was kind of weird. I mean, you know, so when he came and got me, he had like put it on a nail on my door. And I went in there to this interview. I was so nervous, and I decided that, you know, I asked the people who had been interviewed, what happened? Oh, they're just going to show you like a zillion photographs, and they want you to identify people. So I went in there, and literally, I swear, there were more than 350 photographs to go through. And he sat there while I looked at every single picture, and he said, I want you to point out people you know. And I didn't know anybody. I probably did, and I think I did, but, you know, I'm not going to say anything. And he really didn't talk, he just sat there. As if, you know, like where you're sitting, and just stared at me intensely. And I was very uncomfortable, but I think that was his intention, was to make me very uncomfortable. And then he did ask me questions. He asked me if I was involved in, he did ask very specific questions about the 4 days, and if I had been involved in anything other than in these photos from Monday. And what any groups that I had been involved with, part of. And he wanted to know about outside agitators, if I knew anybody who would come on campus. So they had a list of questions, but, and that was it. I never heard from him again.
So, any other questions?
I'm curious as to, you're talking about the further research questions for both from Kent State and it seems that many of those are still relevant. And I'm curious as to whether or not you think oral history would be harder or easier if Kent State shootings happen today, where everyone carries around a digital recording device, and yet sometimes the narrative gets taken away from those who are there. I'm reminded of the UC Davis pepper spray incidents, which became memes almost instantly. So, what do you think of that?
Yeah, boy, that's a tough question. You know, the filmmaker Brian De Palma says the camera tells 24 lies a second, which was a response to the 24 truths a second. And even, I don't know, let me answer that just with a little bit of backing up. So, as I mentioned at Kent State, the shootings occurred in front of the School for Journalism. Everyone had a camera out there. Everyone, there's an 8mm film taken. There was, some of you may have heard, there was a audio recording they said it was discovered, but it was actually used in the trial. But it was at the Yale archive. There's an audio recording where some claim that they hear maybe an order to fire. It's a little inconclusive. I kind of wish that the person who said that, I think I hear something, but it's kind of like, do I really hear it, or did he sort of suggest it? I don't know, because it was so loud and noisy. I think, but I think oral history is done today. I think the standards are pretty much exactly the same. I don't think it necessarily changes. I think in some ways, the more media you have, the more confusing it gets. Even the JFK assassination, there's a ton of footage on that, and there's a million different interpretations about it. So I think, again, just kind of, if I did interviews today about an event that happened here, I don't think I would proceed really any differently, and I would certainly use written documentation to collaborate my sources. Yeah, Robert. I think we have time. One more. If anyone has one. Oh, you have one. Okay.
What's your next project?
That's what I'm working on. So again, that's kind of what I showed at the here was, I think a good follow-up is connecting, kind of seeing events here in the South Bay and maybe how they compare to events at Kent, how they compare to other events going around in the Bay at the time. I think, again, I'm really interested in how, and the impact of Kent State on student protest, like Tom talked about, because again, it's a pretty big myth that it ended protests, which you hear sometimes. There is a collection at Kent called the Campus Strike Collection, where there were campus strikes that just came up all over the place, and I was interested because I didn't know what I was going to find. But when I looked at Hobart Burns's papers and then some of the administrative papers from the late 60s and 1970, it was really interesting, I think, to find some connections and mentions of this event. So yeah, we'll see where it goes. Thank you very much.